I love this road. And I think about my father coming home from Natchez on his horse. According to their journals, they traveled a great deal back then. They thought nothing of spending a couple of days getting to New Orleans and taking a boat and going up to New York, going down to Cuba. They traveled a lot. They had none of the conveniences that we have today. None of the methods of communication. One day on his horse, and as he came around one of these curves, he saw dust coming up. And he got off his horse and went up on the little hill and looked over. And in the middle of the road, there was a rattlesnake all coiled up. And a king snake was going round and round and round, making this dust. And then he dove in and stretched the rattlesnake out and killed it. Some of these bushes, azaleas, flowers, are ones that my great-grandfather planted. Some of these trees. When my great-grandfather built this major part of Elgin, he built it onto a 1792 overseer's cottage. And there were 1,000 acres. He was a practicing physician at the time that he bought this land. And he met the daughter of a local doctor, Annis Dunbar, and fell in love with her and married her. They lived right across the road at the forest plantation. And he brought her over here, and they had 4 children. And he gave up his medical practice and took up horticulture. He wanted to develop another product in addition to cotton that would enhance the entire region. It would give a second crop. And he felt that our climate was suitable, and that's what he experimented with. Peaches, pears, plums. He has wonderful journals. LSU, the Louisiana State University, has copies of all his journals. And they say it's the best documentation of the early methodologies of farming of the antebellum South. So he was a visionary. He was quite a man for all seasons. And historians have acclaimed him a leading horticulturist of the antebellum South, and that had he lived long enough, he would have indeed attained his goal of developing fruit orchards. But he and Annis, my great-grandmother, were both stricken with yellow fever and died very early. He was in his 40s, she was in her 30s, leaving their 4 children orphaned at very early ages. The 10-year-old, John Flavel, was my grandfather, and he inherited the major part of the estate, tradition of the eldest son in the family. When John Flavel reached his 16th birthday, he ran off and joined the war between the states. So my grandfather actually fought in the war between the states. He was with General Breckinridge and survived the war. And then Breckinridge helped him get into Washington College, which is now Washington and Lee. He finished there, came back to Natchez and married Judge Winchester's daughter Louisa, and brought her out here to Elgin, and they had 9 children. And the youngest of those 9 was my father, Hyde Russ Jenkins. And Daddy lived here until he was 15. And then Captain Jenkins, my grandfather, sold Elgin, and they moved into the Winchester house in Natchez. And the house was sold 3 more times. the property diminished to 25 acres when Dr. and Mrs. Calhoun bought it in 1975. They bought the house, and thank goodness, Ruth Ellen and I are childhood friends, and she's done a beautiful job of restoring the house to what my great-grandfather intended, a lovely southern home.
Well, I'm George Marshall, and I grew up here at Lansdowne. This house was built by my and my sister's great-grandparents back before the American Civil War. So we have been here ever since. Lansdowne was a working plantation, continued to be all the years I was growing up. It's no longer a working plantation now, but until about 1960, we were a working plantation. In fact, some of the background shots for the movie Showboat. The movie came out, I think, in 1952 with Howard Keel, Ava Gardner, and they did some of the background shots here. The movie was not made here, but the opening shots for the movie were made. They showed the front of the house. I think some of our sheep were in the yard. I'm not sure about that. But they made some film of the people picking cotton right up here in the cotton field. This was not a staged picture or costume or anything. We were just working in the field. There were maybe 40 or 50 people there, and they came out and started filming. So we ended up in the movie. We were right at the front of the movie Showboat, where they opened it up and show the front of the house, people working in the field. And they have a little boy rides by on a mule, says, "Showboats are coming." That was Walter Pope Jr., who grew up on this place. He's been gone now for a good many years. But it was quite a realistic scene for a movie like that, because the working conditions here at that time probably had not changed much in 100 years. We were getting some mechanized things like tractors, but we were still doing some farming with mules and horses. And of course, we had the whole menagerie of animals here on the plantation. We had geese, chickens, ducks, guineas, turkeys, cattle, a couple of hundred sheep, horses, mules, the whole 9 yards that you would expect to find on a farm, on a working plantation. And when I was younger, I remember hauling cotton in trailers to the cotton gin. We were using a cotton gin across the river over in Faraday at that time. And so they were picking the cotton and putting in long sacks that you would drag along the ground and dump them into the trailer. And in fact, the movie Showboat, I think, shows one of our trailers with cotton in it. In growing up here, a lot of my time was spent out in the woods, out in the fields. I had 5 bird dogs, 2 Brittany Spaniels, 2 setters, 1 pointer. I did a lot of quail hunting. Quail's a thing of the past now. I haven't seen a quail on this place in probably 40 or 50 years. The ecology has changed a lot. So we don't have quail anymore, but we do have coyotes. And a lot of animals that people used to hunt a lot, like raccoons and possums. And I think those animals now are causing a lot of depredation of other forms of wildlife, simply because they're not being hunted. People are really not hunting. Not rural people living out in cabins in the woods. They're not hunting raccoons and squirrels and possums and things like that. So I think they are taking their toll of some of the bird population. That we have armadillos here and other kinds of animals that we did not have when I was growing up. The reason I'm mentioning animals is because growing up on a plantation like this, I'm very close to and very oriented to nature. So it's always in my mind, the land, the things that live on it, always been important to me in my life. And as you can guess, I'm very conservation-minded and a tree hugger as well.
Catherine Miller. The lady in the portrait over there was my sort of like my godmother. We called her Play Mama. And she was the lady that started the Natchez Spring Pilgrimage in 1932. She taught 9 of her, we'd had a terrible ice storm. And the people had come to see the gardens, and there were no gardens. So she taught 9 of her friends into putting on their grandmother's wedding dress, which was a hoop skirt, and opening their houses. So that was the beginning of what really has saved this little town. Tourism has been a wonderful industry for us. Well, when the Millers died, they had no children, and they left the house to their nephew, Buddy Miller. Now, in the meantime, I was born and raised here, but I married and moved away for 30 years. And when my husband died, I decided to come back home. So I came back to Natchez in 1986. And Buddy Miller heard I was in town. And he called me and he said, now, Ethel, if you take care of Hope Farm, keep it on tour, I'll sell it to you with everything in it. Well, I couldn't turn that down. I mean, it's got fabulous treasures in every room. I went to school right here in Natchez, in the public school, and I went to college in Virginia, in Sweetbriar in Virginia, and then went to New York to work, and that's where I met my husband. And he would never have been happy here, I don't think. You know, no, I don't think so. But when he died, I thought, well, I'll give it a try. So I did. But it was wonderful growing up in Natchez. Nobody locked their doors. Everything, we were all so safe. And of course, when we had a date, the parents all knew each other, so, you know, there was none of this phoning ahead to find out if everything was safe. It was all very safe. And we walked everywhere. Walked to school, walked to church, walked everywhere. Mm-hmm. We didn't have a car till after we got out of college. So it was a different life than my children have had, but it was a happy life, very safe life. I loved sports. I did tennis and golf, and we never rode horses. Even when we went to camp in the summertime, they didn't really appeal to me because we weren't raised with them. My father and brothers were all wonderful hunters, and they had bird dogs and that kind of thing, but they didn't own horses. So I was a city girl. I wasn't raised in the country, even though Natchez is kind of a country town, but I was raised right in town.
Come look at this. We're going to look over at the servants' quarters. These are the servants' quarters. And Ruth Ellen has a bed and breakfast. But I feel so fortunate to have a good friend who wants to keep my family history alive. That means a great deal to me, to honor their memory. And she's very gracious about that. Catherine called the ladies and said, we'll open our homes. And for 4 days, they opened their homes and showed the members of the State Garden Club their homes and their furnishings. And they had tea and lunch. And the ladies were so appreciative, they wanted to come back the following year. And Mrs. Miller went to the club and said, why don't we open our homes to the world? And we will charge admission, and that will help us maintain and restore our property. That was 1932. And from that very humble beginning, At our federal level today, we have the National Register of Historic Places, and we have National Historic Landmarks. We were the first pilgrimage in the United States. So that group of ladies started a movement of restoration and preservation that has saved so much for our children and grandchildren. They're to be commended for their efforts. And now, so many, many places, communities have projects to showcase their history. It's a wonderful movement. Preserving your history. If you don't know your history, if you can't look back and see where you've come from, it's difficult to look ahead and see where you're going.
We always took it for granted that this house was open for tourists. We were in the first group of houses that went on the Natchez tours in 1932 when I was 2 years old. Of course, when you live in a place like this, you're aware of your family history. In fact, most people who come here are amazed, almost stunned that we know as much as we do about our family and the things that have happened here for the last couple of 100 years. I always tell people that if you want to save your family history, don't move. Stay in the same place and you'll retain your family history, but of course it's going to be hanging around your neck all the time. You're going to have to regurgitate it to people constantly. But we are very aware of family history, and I can tell things that happened 100 years ago because that memory has been retained in the family. For example, December 9th, 1865, we were broken into by Union soldiers. They were stationed here in Natchez, and they were illegally outside of their own stockade. They were beyond the picket lines, which I think was the phrase that was used in that day to mean that they were illegally off of their stockade. They broke in through the back bedroom door. In fact, that room was used as a nursery at the time. Broke in through the back door of the nursery. You can see where they broke the panel out down at the bottom. And later, of course, repaired. They held the family at gunpoint in the front bedroom. Knocked my great-grandmother down with a rifle because she wouldn't give them the keys to the closets. Although they did a considerable amount of damage here, looking for valuables. We don't know how much exactly. There are various estimates given. I hesitate to give an estimate. But they were out marauding around like some soldiers in all armies will do. And I tell this story, and incidentally, I have the court-martial papers on all of these guys. They were all court-martialed by their own army, the United States Army, right here in Natchez, because this was 1865. The Civil War was over. So they were court-martialed by their own army. They all got 5 years in prison. The ringleader, they were not under command, but the ringleader got 5 years at Fort Pickens in Pensacola to serve with a ball and chain on his leg for the first year. So they paid rather heavily. But as I say, I tell this story to all of our visitors, including, of course, visitors from other parts of the country. And visitors from other parts of the country had ancestors who fought in that terrible war and died and suffered. So I make it point of mentioning that I mention this only for historical reasons, for human interest reasons. These things happen in wartime, and things much worse than that happen in many cases too. But I give that as an example of information that we retain because we have been here for so long. In fact, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Robert Gunbar, lived on this site in 1780, 23 years before the Louisiana Purchase. We don't know anything about the original house that he had here. Boy, that kind of history, you retain all kinds of information like that. And there are other stories, things that I remember, things that people told me, or things that they said, things that happened, long, long ago. Whereas most families, moving as they do from one place to another, sometimes 2 or 3 times within 3 or 4 years, they just lose that family history, And so they're quite surprised that I can talk about things as if the past was still here. Of course, as you know, I think it was William Faulkner who said in the South, the past is not only not forgotten, it's not even past. And this is very true. It's very true. Our family cemetery is right out here, a few hundred yards away. And we have about 5 other cemeteries, family cemeteries, in the woods that have been abandoned, and limbs and trees are growing through them now. So all of these people are still here, in a way. In a way, they're still here. As long as you talk about them and remember them, they somehow seem to be present almost. Not being mystical about it, but there's a sense of that. Well, this is our family cemetery. My great-grandfather, George, who built this house, and his wife, Charlotte Hunt, and some of their children, over here, Mariah Chotar and Coralie Byrne. These are 2 little girls that didn't live very long at all. In fact, one of them lived to be 10 months and 2 days old, and the other one lived to be 10 months and 4 days old. So lifespan was very short for children in those days. And then over here was, of course, another one of their children, and she lived to be about 4 years of age. I'm not quite sure how they tolerated it in those days to lose young ones so early on, so early. And over here is buried Susan Gruby. She was a slave belonging to the family before the Civil War. And she died in 1916. She stayed with the family after the Civil War. And her husband, Robert, is also buried there. But there's no marking on the grave to indicate that. And some of the other tombs in here, my mother here, and my father, George, over there. He was George the Third, and I'm George the Fourth, and my son is George the Fifth, and his son is George the Sixth. So we've kept that name.
The life I knew growing up in Natchez was around lots of old families that were friends of my parents, and a lot of them were relatives. And they were all World War II veterans, or they grew up in the Depression, and then they were hit with World War II, and people drank heavily. People drank liquor, they drank bourbon
Heavy.
and scotch. They didn't drink beer, they didn't drink wine, they drank a lot of hard liquor.
They didn't know anything about
They
it.
didn't know about wine or beer, and it wasn't a problem that you were drinking lots of heavy alcohol and waking up every weekend with a bad hangover, and that your cousin was walking home from your house down the street to his home with no clothes on in the middle of the night.
That was perfectly acceptable.
That you probably know who I mean.
I do
The
know what you
Big
mean.
Red. So it was all added up in the end to quite a few problems for a lot of people, and you know, it had
But
a
we
big
just
impact.
considered them eccentric.
It seemed
not-
eccentric. It seemed like party time. You know, when it would all start. By the time it was over, it was a lot of difficulties.
Yeah, I agree with you.
So that's just one example.
And then everybody was forgiven for everything, as far as I remember anyway, Joe.
There also was not a lot of money for a lot of people. Money was very short for a lot of people. My parents never made a lot of money. They had a lot of trouble keeping the house up. They disagreed over how to keep the house up. It was my father's home, but my mother was the one who wanted to see it restored and improved and made beautiful, and my father didn't feel that it was
What
worth
did your father
spending the
do
money.
for a living?
He was in life insurance.
Okay.
So this was also a difficult profession to go into because you were dependent on commissions primarily. My mother worked as well. They both worked all of their lives. They had jobs.
And how many children in your family?
4. There were 4 children.
I remember.
But see, also my father's mother lived in the house. She had the bedroom. My parents lived in the billiard room. My sisters lived in the front parlor. And my brother and I lived in a little room on the rear corner of the gallery. And my uncle lived in the cottage. He was a bachelor highway patrolman.
And what was your
Uncle
uncle's
Ken,
name?
my father's brother. His name was Joseph Newman Stone III, but he was called Cap. And that's because he was always in law enforcement. He was chief of police. He was with the sheriff's department. He was a highway patrolman at the end of his life. But he had quite a drinking problem that, with diabetes, led to the loss of a limb and a lot of sorrow. And
You're right. But people didn't talk about it much. They put on a happy face.
Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely.
always.
This is the grave of my grandmother, who lived with my family when I was growing up. She lived in the front bedroom, and we called her Nana. She was the daughter of a Southern belle named Anne Thornhill, and actually a Union Army officer who came to Natchez in the 1860s with the Union occupation. So Natchez, it said, was very friendly with the Union forces, and instead of trying to fight the war, Natchez entertained a lot of these Union people in their homes. And in fact, my grandmother here was the daughter of a Natchez belle, as I said, and a Union Army officer. So that's the kind of thing that was going on in Natchez. Instead of a war, they were falling in love. They married after the war. And so my grandmother, who, as I said, lived with us, had a very different attitude about a lot of things. So as I was growing up, our attitude was influenced quite a bit by her. She didn't like negative talk about the people who were descended from Africans, and she was a very strong presence in the home. She was married to Joseph Newman Stone II, who is right next to her here, and he was the third generation of Stones in Natchez. My earlier ancestor from the Stone family was my great-great-grandfather, as I mentioned before, who was born in New Jersey. But Joseph Newman Stone, who's buried right here, served as chief of police here in this town, and he had 4 children with his wife, Mary Caroline Callan Stone, and of course one of them was my father, Charles Henry Stone. Of his 4 children, One of them is also buried over here. He was a bachelor, and he also served in law enforcement. He was chief of police also at one time, and also served with the sheriff's department and with the highway patrol. Over here is my father's grave. My father, Charles Henry Stone, is named after my great-great-grandfather, Charles Henry Stone, the one that I mentioned before, who was actually born in New Jersey. Natchez had lots of doctors and lawyers coming here from the Northeast because it was a really prosperous town and they knew that they could make a great living. But some of them also got into the plantation field and made lots of money. Charles Henry Stone did not, as far as I know. He just worked as a doctor. He married up in Natchez. He married a Natchez native named Mary Giddings Newman, who had an important grandfather named Samuel Brooks, who served as the first mayor of Natchez when the town first incorporated in 1803. That was the same year as the Louisiana Purchase, when this vast expanse of a large part of North America was purchased from France to finance Napoleon's wars. And so he married Mary Giddings Newman. They actually had 5 sons who fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War, and they all survived. And one of them was Joseph Newman Stone I, my great-grandfather, who is buried over here with his tallest stone stand. He was actually born down in Woodville, Mississippi, and then died in Natchez in 1886. And Joseph Newman Stone was married to someone from New York, actually. Her name was Theodora Britton. She's in the grave to the right of his grave. They married and had quite a few children and are my great-grandparents. They bought the house I live in 1877. This stone here to the left of his is their firstborn child, a little boy. He was also named Charles Henry Stone, and he died tragically. He was playing in a tree. He fell out of the tree onto an iron picket fence and was impaled in the neck on the iron pickets and died as a result of that accident. The flag is actually a Confederate flag. It represents the rebellious states of the Confederacy that went to war against the Union states. These flags are not placed here by me. They're placed by people who come here. They're probably sons of the Confederacy. I am one of these people descended from Confederate soldiers, but I have never joined this organization. This flag is very controversial. It also appears as an emblem on the state flag of the state of Mississippi even today. There are people who would like to see it removed. A lot of black people find these little Confederate flags objectionable because they represent the Old South before the Civil War, where slavery was a part of the way of life and a part of the economy. But these flags, as you'll see, are all over this cemetery. People come in here and put them in front of people who are either veterans of the Civil War or whose families were involved in fighting for the Confederacy, and that's why you see them everywhere.
The barges, you see, the barges. That's my brother's business. Medallion Dock and Storage. The tugboats and the river's out. The river is such an integral part of our lives. Literally growing up on it, and of course, when I was growing up, we didn't have the bridges. We had a ferry boat that went across. And when Daddy was growing up, they didn't even have a ferry boat. But when the Corps of Engineers put the levee system up across the river, it took off 125 acres of our waterfront. And so it changed a lot of the direction of the river. And the river's trying to change direction again. It's headed down to the Atchafalaya Basin now, which the Corps of Engineers is trying to keep it in its course. But my money's on the river. And there is a lot. There used to be a lot of fishing. We used to have tiny, tiny river shrimp. They were so good, but they're all gone. They're all gone. Now, my father was a great outdoorsman. He loved to hunt and to fish, but not so much on the river itself as on the backwaters, the tributaries of the river and the swamps that it would create. Like Butler's Lake, which is further down south. We went fishing there. When the river gets real high, it overflows, and then it fills these bar pits, and they're wonderful. They have all kinds of good fish. That's a lot of fun. And then you go and seine them. You make a slough and put your net across it, and the water comes in. In the springtime, before the Corps of Engineers put the levee system up, the river would flood 50 miles. As far as you could see, there was water. And it left all this wonderful silt, very rich, fertile ground. And that's why the plantations were over here. The working plantations were over here. It was flat, it was easy to till, and it was very, very fertile. But then when they put the levee system up, it stopped. It stopped the flooding. And it changed the whole course of the river. But it's still flat, and it's still used for farmland. We now have soybeans and rice, and some cotton, not as much as we used to. The boll weevil came in and really killed our cotton industry, which of course hurt so many of our plantation owners.
This is Dr. Carmichael's medical license from the state of New Jersey, dated 1787. And as you can see, the entire license is written out by hand. So you could make a good living writing out documents and certificates if you had a good handwriting in the 18th century. Carmichael had no family of his own, so he left his estate to the nephew John Jenkins, And when Jenkins came down here, just like C.H. Stone, he married up by marrying a Natchez native with an important grandfather. Her name was Annis Dunbar. She's pictured here. She was the granddaughter of William Dunbar, who surveyed the 31st parallel with Andrew Ellicott after he raised the American flag here. And this was in the
I know. Yeah. MIC, I wrote a very, very long time ago.
Interesting event there until it was sold to me in 2008.
Wow.
And it's an American-made square-grained piano. It's not really in much playing condition. Y'all are a great audience.
Love the music.
Thank you. So my pleasure. I hope you'll come back.
Concert was wonderful.
Thank you.
That was very nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your hospitality.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Joe?
Come back and see me and look at my Madison State.
Thank you for sharing your house and the beautiful music.
My pleasure.
Enjoyed it as always. I'll see you again
Yes,
soon.
good to see you again.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Nice to meet you.